This sounds like a stupid question.
Probably is, because, yeah, go ahead. Skilled managers equals high morale, which equals all that cool stuff that you cannot pay for and you can't punish for.
When you close off that feedback channel, you are not going to be able to hear the truth.
In the first microseconds, your brain can't tell the difference between physical danger and what we call social danger.
I'm pissed off at you.
Me, specifically?
Well, just because you're my boss and all.
Employees tend to get promoted until they reach their level of incompetence. Go forward and don't suck.
Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening. I don't know what time you're listening to this podcast, but welcome to another episode of the Managing with Mind and Heart podcast. We are your co-hosts. We have Mike over here. Mike,
Hello.
Say hi.
Hi, it's just in case you care, it's 12:55 in the afternoon.
By the way, I like your shirt today.
You do?
I like Mike and Ike.
Yep.
Appropriate. I am Ethan, and I am your other co-host, and we are so glad to be with you today. Real quick, before we get this show started, random question. What is something cool or interesting you're into recently?
You're asking your listeners or
No, you.
me?
Yeah, I'm just curious. Like,
You're not going to
I haven't seen you for like a week or something. I just wanted to see, like, what is something cool or interesting that you found?
Well, that's actually apropos. Very, very recently, I have gotten into Texas Hold'em.
Texas Hold'em.
I find myself now in a Monday night Texas Hold'em game with a group of great guys in a garage up in the woods with a wood stove and some alcohol. And last time there was about 8 people that kind of came and went. $20 to play. You can buy in again if you want to. It was really fun.
So you're just into Texas Hold'em.
It's going to be my new thing.
How did that happen?
It was random. We played that last Christmas.
Yeah, we did
a little bit with the family. You did really well, and that was disappointing for me. So I thought
that was motivation enough.
That's never going to happen again. Okay. So I have become a bit of a. Well, no, I'm not an expert. I'm a beginner, but I at least know how to play now really well.
Gotcha. Preparing for next holiday.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So that was fun. How about you? Are you into anything?
Geez, I feel like I'm always into something new every week, and it lasts about a week.
Like, what's your current week thing?
I think one thing is just that I've found a really cool playlist that I've listened to like every day.
Is this the one you sent me?
Yeah, this is the one I sent you.
Oh my gosh,
folks! It's on Spotify. Love Spotify. First one's on Spotify. And it is called Electronic Jazz Vibes. Electric Jazz Vibes. Look it up. It's got like a picture of a stormtrooper on it, but it's like a mix between like old school jazz, like anything from
Nat King Cole was on there. Frank Sinatra was on there. And then there was this really modern, there was some really cool jazz rap.
Yeah,
I never heard of before.
Yeah, some stuff with kind of like Chance the Rapper on there and some like remixes of stuff. Anyways, that's something cool and interesting that I'm into recently.
Yeah, Stevie Wonder's
on there. So it's a pretty wide-ranging list, but I mean, it keeps you on your toes.
Yeah, it was awesome.
Anyways, just felt like having a fun conversation before we get into business.
Well, let's do it. Come on.
So, welcome to the last episode of our series on behavior styles. Mm-hmm. Go back, listen to all the other episodes first before you get to this one. This one is kind of the conclusion, which is we're really going to just span a lot of topics. We're going to get into areas that we weren't able to cover in the other episodes, hopefully keep ourselves out of trouble, and it's going to be interesting. Bear with us because we're going to change topics probably pretty quickly here, and we're going to be all over the board. But we're just going to see how this conversation goes.
Yeah, and I think before we do that, let's just, again, real quickly, I want to recap not the information we've shared. We've talked about conductors, analyzers, listeners, and promoters, but the why. Just again, why does this matter? Why is this important? And maybe, Ethan, you and I can maybe take turns a little bit, why this matters to you, why this matters to me. But I'm going to start with, I don't think it's possible to be an effective manager if you're not growing as a human being, right? If you're stuck, and I don't mean stuck for a week or a year. I mean, you're the kind of human that's not growing ever. I think your people that you're supervising see it and suffer for it. Your colleagues see it. You're probably going to show up defensively. You're going to probably show up pretty rigid, maybe not even very approachable, certainly not very trustworthy, because it's just hard to trust somebody who's not, growing and changing and developing. And behavior styles gives you this awesome opportunity to notice the way you're showing up, to notice some of the growth opportunities, and then to make those slight adjustments. So for me, that's one of the main reasons to do behavior styles, is so that we can keep growing and developing as humans.
Yeah, I think that's great. And that's something that I absolutely believe in as well. I think you almost have a responsibility as a manager, as a leader, whatever term you want to use there, to be growing yourself so you can better lead those around you. Yeah. I think the other reason why behavioral styles is important is I think we've all been in a situation where we just thought to ourselves, we're surrounded by idiots. I'm just surrounded by idiots. Some cases that may be true, but also if you're one of those people that always thinks you're surrounded by idiots, it's probably not them. But my point being is, for a lot of us, myself included, for a long time, it wasn't even on my radar that people showed up differently in different situations, and they were just different than me, and that's okay. Right? They have their own features with that and their own bugs. So understanding the way people show up allows you to better interact with them, have more empathy for them. And then, of course, knowing that we all are different and we all have our own growth opportunities, it brings forth a sense of unity in growing together as a unit. Right?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think you're spot on. I think it allows me to reinterpret the way I'm seeing someone else. It allows me to have more grace and understanding. And side note, Surrounded by Idiots.
Yeah.
Right? It's an actual book.
It is a book
about behavior styles. If our listeners are interested, it's by Thomas Erickson.
Well, I say we dive into some of these subjects today.
Let's do it.
So far, we've obviously covered what behavioral styles are, what they are not in the first episode. And then we talked about each behavioral style.
Yep.
Behavior style. You always get on me for saying behavioral style.
It's not a big deal, but these are called behavior styles.
Behavior styles.
Behavioral styles.
Right. So there's 4 of them. We have our promoters, we have our analyzers, we have our conductors, and we have our listeners. And we talked about their top 10 wants, needs, and expectations, and then each one of their growth opportunities. We're going to change gear a little bit now. And we're going to start with talking about trust. We talked a bit about trust last episode when we were covering the listeners. Let's dive into it a little bit more.
Yeah, a little review, a little deeper dive here. Let's say a couple things about trust for each style. Where do you want to start?
Like, which style do we start with?
Yeah, who do we start with?
Well, let's start with our analyzers and promoters, since those two are a little bit more symmetrical in a way.
Yeah, that's a good point. So first of all, you may want to go back. We talked about capital T, lowercase t, trust when we did our episode on by whens and reliability.
And we talked about a bit with throughout these behavioral styles episodes.
Yeah, so just a reminder, when we use the word trust is being asked to carry way too much weight. It's just such a huge word, Christy trusts me to be faithful to her, but she doesn't trust me to remember avocados at the store. So which trust are we talking about here, right? So most of the time, when we're talking about trust here, here's the concept. We're mostly talking about lowercase t trust. It's kind of the little things, but the problem in relationships and in the workplace, even more specifically, the more violations of lowercase t trust, the more that actually starts to be experienced as a capital T trust issue, right? So for example, if you don't follow through on a whole bunch of things over time, well, I don't trust you about your follow through, but it starts to feel like I just don't trust you. And that becomes a really big trust and respect relationship issue.
Right. No, that makes sense. All those little T's can eventually turn into a big T type of trust.
That's exactly right. And so let's start with promoters. Promoters, be careful. Be careful, folks, because our tendency is to get excited and promise a bunch of things and not do all those things. And then we forgive ourselves and we figure everyone knows we're busy. Our tendency is to maybe say we're going to do some things and maybe not write it down and maybe forget or change our mind. We don't do it. And again, we think people forgive us, right? People get it. People know we're busy. we forgive ourselves. And so we don't realize that we can leave a little bit of a wake behind us of people thinking, oh, well, he said he was going to do that, but he hasn't done it that way in the past, right? He hasn't followed through. So I don't really trust him.
So this is more on the receiving side of trust, right? How promoters receive trust.
Are we trusted?
Yeah,
yes.
Are we trusted, right?
Yes.
And so they're often big and immediate. So I think what we said in the promoters episode is they tend, if they're not careful, right? This is before they made adjustments, they tend to get grain of salted.
Yeah, okay, when the promoter says, there was, 50 people there, well, you know what, there was maybe 30, because last time he said 50, there wasn't even close. Or the promoter says, I checked, the answer's 7. Well, did you really check? Because last time I added it up, it was actually 6.7.
Right, so it might be a little bit harder to give these people some trust.
Yeah.
That sense.
Yeah. So it's trust around maybe not being accurate or not being precise. It's also trust around maybe not following through on something. So promoters, be careful. Just know that the other behavior styles out there, specifically the analyzers, but even the other styles, and actually
listeners as well,
and even fellow promoters, right, are going to feel a little bit of that disappointment or that burn when you don't follow through. So promoters, if you're not careful, you might, like Ethan said, get grain of salted, and which means people are not trusting you so much. On the other hand, promoters trust people. It's like, right, welcome to my world, and here's who I am. Tell me about you. I'll tell you all my secrets, and here, borrow my car. And they tend to be glass half full, and I trust the world, and they might even overtrust, and then get burned and disappointed.
Right. Now, I'm going to go down a little rabbit hole here, and probably go down quite a few little rabbit holes during this episode.
Let's do a rabbit hole.
But do you ever see, when it comes to trust, and let's talk about promoters and trust specifically, right? It might be a little bit harder for that to trust them in certain ways. Do you ever see kind of a project syndrome with them? It's easy to look at someone that has maybe some of the same perceived flaws as you do and be really annoyed with that.
Yeah, I'm going to assume our listeners have experienced this in other parts of your life. I think it's a thing. I just think we do tend to be, maybe not everyone, but we tend to be a little bit more sensitive to those things that we don't love about ourselves, and we see it in someone else. I've seen it with every style. Certainly I've seen it with conductors. Boy, he's kind of controlling and bossy, and that translated means I want to be the one in control right now, so I'm annoyed with him. So yeah, I see some of that.
Gotcha. So those are our promoters. And again, with all these, this is before we've made some careful adjustments, right? So, with analyzers, what's the deal with them when it comes to trust?
Yeah, kind of almost the opposite of promoters. As far as being trusted when it comes to little t stuff, they're certainly, again, we're painting with broad strokes, right? But generally, an analyzer who says the answer is 4.7 and you check it out, you're going to find that the answer is 4.7. When they said there were 7 people there were 7 people there. If they say I'm feeling this or this is going on, they've thought about it before they said it, right? They're not just shooting from the hip. So they tend to be trusted in these ways. If they say they're going to get something done on a certain day, again, there's differences in different humans, but generally I can assume that my analyzers are going to get it done.
Okay. Well, so does that also mean that they are going to have a harder time giving that type of trust to other people? Because unless there's someone very similar to them in that analyzerness, those people might not necessarily be as exact, and they might perceive that as, I can't trust them as much as I can trust myself to do it. Right.
Analyzers are going to be more, well, boy, that person is just estimating, or they're shooting from the hip because that person didn't take as much time as they took. So yeah, exactly. They're going to be a little more frustrated with other people when it comes to follow through or preciseness, which can lead to, analyzers having a little bit more trouble trusting others.
I see. Now, before we get into the other two, I just want to ask you, how does understanding the way people give and receive trust in the workplace, how is that useful in the way that we can interact, with each other and, have better conversations and deal with interpersonal conflict? I mean, how do we use this practically?
That's a really good question. I think it's important that each of us sort of examine our definition of trust and be open to trust having so many facets. I mean, and so to not be quick to I don't trust that person, or I do trust that person. I think it's important for us to be a little more nuanced about the way we see trust. And so, that promoter who tends to maybe exaggerate a little bit or say what they're feeling, and I hate my job, but that's not really how they feel in general. Maybe allow for some of that, maybe give a little bit more room, maybe not jump to conclusions.
Right.
I think if we understand these differences, we might be able to sort of modify our definition of trust, make it a little more flexible as we work with each of the different styles.
Yeah.
And I also think it leads to some good feedback conversations, right?
Oh, yeah.
Gives me an opportunity to say, hey, this is what I'm experiencing. And I'm not going to just jump to some conclusion that you're not trustworthy or that, you don't think I'm trustworthy or whatever the case may be.
Right.
Let's have a conversation.
And I think it also has to do with, understanding the way, not only how other people show up with trust, but understanding the way you show up with trust and how that might be affecting your relationships in the workplace, both negatively and positively. I mean, that in a sense is about being vulnerable, right? And vulnerability builds trust, and trust builds vulnerability. So it's kind of a chicken and egg right there. And I can talk more about that vulnerability piece later, but let's jump into the other two styles. So the first two, analyzers and promoters, like I said, were pretty symmetrical. These next two aren't quite. So listeners, from what I understand about listeners, is generally at base nature, they tend to start with trust.
Yeah, they start with trust, exactly. And trust for them is going to be a little bit more dependent on some things that are a little bit more relational. So their trust is going to be based on the fact that, for example, you treat people really well. Mm-hmm. I trust you. Mm-hmm. You said you were going to give me a call on Thursday night, and you did. I trust you. If you didn't, I might take that personally. So it starts to feel a little bit more relational. So my trust as a listener might lean toward that. Does that make sense?
That does make sense, yeah.
And then I think being trusted, this is interesting. Listeners, I think, again, broad strokes, I think they're they follow through. I think they're relatively easy to trust in most ways. However, they have a bit of a sticking point when it comes to speaking their truth. Unfortunately, sometimes when a listener says yes or seems to agree or goes along and says, yeah, that's fine, I'm fine with that decision, they might not really feel that way. And you might find that out later. And that I've experienced that with some listeners at times. I've seen this in the workplace before. Really kind, nice people. You would never think that you wouldn't trust this person. Mm-hmm. But the place where trust can be a little bit tricky for listeners is, do they really mean it when they said yes? Did they really mean it when they went along? And then I have to second guess it. Well, you said yes. Do I have to ask you again to make sure you really mean yes?
And should you?
It depends. I think, again, I can think of actually a person in my life that I've found myself doing that. I found myself, and it's worked. I found myself saying, "Hey, are you sure about that? Do you want to think about it?" And there's been a couple times this person has said, "Well, you know what? No, that's not really what I think."
Right. Yeah, the way I look at that in some scenarios is appropriate adjustment to make based on your understanding of behavioral styles. Right?
It is.
This person sometimes has a hard time speaking their truth. So knowing that, let me check in after the fact and make sure that's what they meant.
Yeah,
after that time, the process.
And maybe give them some more time. I have to be careful with my need to get a quick answer. Right. So if I give a listener more time, I'm probably more likely to get the real answer, right? Now, for listeners, though, again, the reminder, folks, is, just really continue to practice speaking your truth. You will show up more solid and more trustworthy when you can say things like, I'm not sure, I need some more time, or I disagree,
right?
Or no.
Now, what happens when you lose trust with your listeners? And is it very difficult to lose trust with them?
This gets, again, I'm always a little sensitive to, in fact, all of these topics. Like it just sounds like we're being super stereotypical. But again, remind our listeners that we know there's not four kinds of people in the world.
Right.
Lots of ranges here, but yes, I will see a little more tendency for listeners to, if you lose trust with them, they might not tell you that. You might think things are fine. They might continue to nod and smile and go along, but they aren't feeling it anymore. They're not feeling the trust. And they may not let you know that. And by the time you get to that truth, it might have been pretty solidly dug in, and it might be harder to undo it. So here's what I say lots of times to listeners. I think that you guys sometimes have a tendency to, it's not easy to get outside your circle of trust. Listeners are pretty loyal, and they give you a lot of grace. It's not easy to fall outside your circle of trust, but when you do, it's kind of like good luck. It's kind of hard to get back in.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that.
Yeah.
Conductors.
So
conductors, tell us about conductors.
I don't like talking about this piece.
Yeah, it feels a little bit like self-serving in a way.
Well, yeah, because I'm a conductor, and
so am I.
And I'm not making this up, but yeah, you kind of all the 4 styles, this one topic, just trust, is the one where it kind of feels like we're giving the conductors a little bit of a free pass here. Not in every other way, because conductors, we've talked about you guys need to chill out in lots of ways, right? But conductors don't struggle with this too much. In general, conductors tend to trust trustworthy people and not trust untrustworthy people. Go figure, right? A little more likely to be reality-based. Also a little bit more nuancy, right? I don't trust you to get things done on time, but I do trust you to tell me the truth, right? They're a little bit more likely to parse out the different elements of trust and apply them accordingly.
I see.
So yeah, in that one case, I feel like they're a little bit more reality-based.
Right.
So please no angry emails from you listeners and analyzers and promoters. You have wonderful qualities.
Right. And yeah, again, conductor, analyzer, that trust piece is going to show up a little bit differently, and so on and so forth with all the other combinations.
Yeah, that's a good point. For most of us, very few of us are just straight conductors or straight listeners, right? We have a secondary, we have a tertiary. So these other aspects of trust are going to come and go.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, just because we're on the subject of trust, and I'm going to take a risk here with kind of going down again another small little rabbit hole here. This might sound a little bit quacky in a way, but
quacky.
Yeah, quacky. But I just a minute ago, I mentioned talking about trust and vulnerability. I really do think that with understanding, again, the way that you might tend to give trust or might, tend to get trust from others, and having an open dialogue about that with those in the workplace, like, hey, I have a hard time trusting you when you do this, or hey, I get a sense you don't trust me when I do this. Again, it's about being vulnerable with each other. And there's a lot of really cool research out there on vulnerability that I've been looking into recently. Brene Brown has done a lot of really good work on vulnerability. And she says the definition of vulnerability is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. But vulnerability is not weakness. It's our most accurate measure of courage. So again, I really do believe that talking about and the way trust shows up and the way all your growth opportunities might be with behavioral styles brings a sense of vulnerability into the workplace, which actually really does build trust for everybody. So I know we're talking about how trust shows up, but I am talking about trust also in kind of a wider sense here.
Yeah, good.
So something to think about with these behavioral styles and how we have these conversations.
I totally agree. Let's move on. Let's cover a couple of the topics. We want to talk a little bit about how behavior styles show up when we're stressed out, right? What happens for each style when we start to get anxiety and stress? And there's a general sort of formula, and again, it's a little simplistic to explain it this way. It doesn't always look this way, but the idea is when human beings get past sort of optimal stress, right? There's such thing as not having enough stress, not being challenged. You can feel kind of bored. There's too much stress, and that's what we're talking about. When a human being starts to move into that place of feeling overly stressed, what's going to happen first is their primary behavior style is going to show up louder, but it's going to be not the prettiest parts of their behavior style, right? So it's going to be the parts of the behavior style that really aren't quite so self-serving or attractive to others. Those things show up first. So for example, you're going to have I'll start with promoters, right? I'm starting to get stressed out. What do you think, Ethan? A promoter starts to get stressed out. What do I do when I get more stressed out?
So you're going to do more promoter-ish behaviors.
Right.
So you're going to start maybe talking more
Yep.
or
Talking faster,
or being even more big and immediate with things you say.
Yep. I'm going to get a little more frantic and like try to get a bunch more stuff done really fast so I can feel less stressed. You might see some more overreaction. You might see the promoter, get emotional or kind of feel something really strongly, and then that kind of blocks them.
Right. I hate my job. Right. A little more emotionality there.
Yeah. Or hey, you don't like me, and they might get stuck on that. So it's basically taking the promoter stuff that in most cases doesn't show up as a problem. It's just sort of a characteristic. But when they're stressed, it can start to get in the way. So they might start debating. They might talk about everything. They might get emotional and just sort of dump it and then get over it. So that's the idea is when we're feeling stressed, some of our less pretty stuff shows up. But then something really interesting happens. When you get to really stressed out, like red zone danger stress that you don't feel very often, what happens is we actually go into a behavior that's almost the opposite of our style. Like if you look at the behavior style grid, the opposite of a promoter would be an analyzer, right? So what would a promoter do when they're super stressed out? Well, they might shut down. They might emotionally just shut down. They might physically get up and walk out of the room. It's not promoter stuff, is what I'm saying. It's almost more characteristic of what the opposite behavior style would do. So let me kind of repeat that. Moderate to high stress, you're going to become more of your primary, but not the pretty parts. Super high stress, you might kind of flip into this behavior that's kitty corner, opposite.
I wonder why you go there.
I don't really know the psychology of that. It's almost one article I read said that what you're doing is you're going from your primary, you're passing the secondary, you're passing the tertiary, you're going like to the fourth. You're going to your least accessible style when you get to that major stress point.
I see.
So let's play with that with an opposite style. I'll let you kind of work on this with me. Let's do analyzers, right? So analyzers are feeling some pretty stressed out now. What kind of analyzer-ish behaviors might you see?
Well, an analyzer might start just asking even more questions, like really digging in, questioning more. Well, have you thought about this? What if this happens? Right? Kind of being even bigger devil's advocate. They might get slower and even more methodical, maybe even paralyzed even in situations. They might internalize things even more, like you're even more so you're not getting any type of feedback from them on, both emotionally and verbally.
Yeah, they can look like they've just sort of become sort of hard and shut down.
Yeah, and just kind of nitpick on the details as well.
Last Tuesday you said this at 3:47.
Right.
Yep.
And they also might be the ones that just kind of pick it up and walk on out, right? Like I can't be here right now.
Right. So those are all kind of analyzer stuff, but not the pretty parts of analyzer. Sort of exaggerated there, right? Now, extreme stress, right? Opposite, kitty corner. This would be more typical of maybe a promoter. What do they do there?
Maybe they start talking a lot, right? Or they get really emotional, and it's just nobody saw that coming.
Completely not characteristic, right? This is the analyzer who just all of a sudden the emotions show up. They might start crying, or the emotions kind of pour out. It's like, that is so far from where analyzers live day to day, that you've definitely got to a super stress point there.
Oh, okay. Why are we doing this? Why are we talking about, this maybe seem like a dumb question, but why are we understanding the way people show up with stress? Meaning, like the other question I asked, what can we do with this? What should you do with this?
I think the exact same two reasons we keep talking about why we're teaching behavior styles really come into play here. Number one, I am in a relationship with you, Ethan, and I see some of these behaviors, right? I know you're an analyzer. I see you possibly getting maybe more shut down or a little more nitpicky. Instead of being judgy about that or just annoyed by it, I can ask myself, well, what's going on, right? Oh, Ethan is probably feeling some tension or some stress. That's really good for me to know that, because I can give you some grace. I can maybe give you something that you need.
Right. I was about to say, it's not only asking yourself, I wonder what's going on with this person, but recognizing the signs and being able to ask that person,
sure,
hey, what's going on?
Yeah.
Are you feeling stressed right now? What's the reason? Right.
And as a manager, it's pretty valuable, right? If I can see what's happening, if I can see my employees begin to exhibit some of these behaviors, I can wonder, right? Is there some stress happening here? Do I need to check in, like you said? Do I need to change my behavior a little bit? So that's one, right? It just helps me work better with others. And then the other one is, of course, I can recognize my own stress. This has happened to me probably 1,000 times. I can see a behavior before I'm even aware that I'm actually feeling stress. And I can go, I wonder what's going on here for me because I'm seeing these behaviors. Oh, I can connect the dots now, and I can say, oh, that behavior indicates that I'm probably feeling stressed. And sure enough, when I examine it, there it is.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way before, but that's a really good point. You can actually begin to recognize the behaviors before you even had time to process your, emotions at the time, right? And that is a sign that, hey, maybe I need to do some processing of my emotions right now, or like figure out am I feeling stress or is it something else?
Yeah. So for example, and I know I'm kind of jumping ahead here. If I'm a conductor and I start catching myself taking too much control, like sort of getting bossy, if I notice the behavior, or I might notice the other person's reaction to my behavior, I might go, okay, what's going on here? Oh, okay, I'm a conductor. I'm feeling stressed. So of course I'm trying to take control because that'll help me feel less stressed. Well, maybe I should do something else to help myself feel less stressed. Time to take a walk, time to do some processing, time to whatever.
Right. Well, so let's talk about conductors then.
Yeah.
They are going to, when they're in a stressed out place, they're going to do more conductor-like things. Yeah. Those ones that you mentioned become even more controlling, right? Yep. You might get a little bit more of blame sometimes with conductors when they're really stressed out.
Yeah, what that's about, when you see a conductor start to blame, what's happening is what's happening in their sort of unconscious is, let's figure out whose fault this is so we can make sure this never happens again. Mm-hmm. It's not even necessarily a personal thing for them. They're not trying to make people feel bad. They're trying to problem solve, but they're doing it in a way that can sound like blame or shame, right? So yeah, blaming, you might see some anger. Conductors, when they get stressed out, whether they're actually angry or not, it doesn't really matter, but they look angry or they sound angry. That's going to be a sign that your conductor is getting stressed out.
Now, when you have kind of these red line stress conductors, right? They're going to go to their opposite place. So they might start doing more, listener type behavior or, maybe promoter type behavioral.
It's more listener, right? When a conductor gets super stressed out, right? Then this is what you see for a conductor. Really red letter stress. It's the shutdown, but not the same as an analyzer. It's more of the give in. Like, whatever. I don't even care. Just do whatever you're going to do. Don't involve me. Just make a decision and don't even ask my opinion. Just do it, right? It's almost like they give up all control and just sort of throw it away, hand it off, right? That could be a sign of a conductor just at their breaking point.
Right. Look out.
Yep.
Now, another quick question here. If you see someone, say they're a conductor or know they're an analyzer, but they kind of just live out of this stressed out place. Like you can tell either their behaviors are just exaggerated of their behavioral style, right? The not so flattering parts, or they're always in this red line, stressed out place. What can this tell us about the situation that not only they're in, but you're in as well with them?
Yeah, this gets a little judgy, I think, for me. I mean, it feels like that to me. But, it's not uncommon to know somebody who is in this sort of elevated stress place kind of permanently. And so what you're seeing is, the conductor who is kind of chronically over controlling and dictates and seems a little angry, or the promoter who seems like they're just talking too much all the time and changing their mind and dumping it and overreacting and, et cetera. You see that, and that's just kind of the way they show up. That's the way they live. All I can say is that's probably somebody who is living with stress, and whether it's a circumstantial situation that's caused them to kind of permanently be stressed, or they just need to do some self-work. They need to do some self-care. They need to maybe, get some therapy. And I mean that in the best way possible, because, I'm a really big believer in therapy.
Right.
Get some help and work through some of that stuff, because it's possible you're living in a place that is stressed out, and here's the sad thing, it means you're not very happy, right? I mean, you're living with permanent stress. You're not a happy person. And regardless of how you're making other people feel, and I'm thinking about that as secondary. What matters right now is, look, I want you to feel better, right? I want you to enjoy life.
Right.
So work on that, because the byproduct is going to be, not only are you going to be happier, your behaviors are going to be easier for others.
Right. Absolutely. And I think it's also worth looking at, if you're a manager or a leader and you have someone that's constantly in the stressed out place, but they're not the only one in your workplace, that could be a sign that like something is not right, right? Like something is not right in the workplace where you have, multiple people that always seem to be living out of that stressed out zone.
What's wrong with my employees? They're all stressed out.
Right. Again, comes back to it's probably not them.
Right.
Right. So these are symptoms you might want to pay attention to, both in the individual, but as well as, in the system. Last thing I'll say on stress here before we move on is that pushback that I've gotten with this is that, stress isn't all bad. You're right. It's not all bad. There is an optimal level of stress to have, right? Kind of that zone of optimal stress where you are actually performing at your best level because you have a little bit of a push there, right? That we're not saying that nobody should ever be stressed out and having stress in your workplace is bad. These are signs of when people are maybe on a healthy level of stress for them.
Yep.
So
that's good.
Well, let's move along here. What do you want to talk about next?
I got to interrupt you, buddy. So I got to apologize to our listeners out there because we did it again, Ethan. We just skipped right past listeners. We didn't talk about their stress. Listeners, I got to tell you what's going on here.
Sorry.
So first of all, we made the joke previously about, they're not going to complain. Let's skip them. And here we are. We did it. Now, right. I want to take a side note on this. Guys, this happens. Uh-oh. Like in real life. We just did what actually happens. And listeners, I promise this wasn't staged. This just happened.
Right.
I just think that's worth talking about for a minute. And listeners, we apologize to you. Now, it could partly be the fact that Ethan and I, primary secondaries, are covering analyzer, conductor, promoter. Mm-hmm. Right? We actually don't have listener as one of our primary or secondary characteristics. Now, I don't know if that's a thing. I don't know if that might have something to do with this.
Sure.
It also might have something to do with the fact that just the way we teach this class, we always go analyzer, promoter, conductor, listener. We just kind of got that cadence down and we do it. And we thought we were done and we forgot. But I'll just say this, in the workplace, I just think this is kind of spooky because in the workplace, this does happen. Yeah. Listeners get overlooked. And often when they do get overlooked, they don't say anything. So it can start to be a little bit of a pattern.
Yeah. And this time there was nobody here to say anything. Yeah, it also just might be a symptom of me going off on, down another rabbit trail and then forgetting where we left off.
Yeah.
So no hard feelings out there, listeners. I love you, all of you. So, listeners, feeling stressed, moderate stress, moderate to high. One thing that's going to happen is they are going to be more likely to acquiesce, to give in, to look for agreement, to look for harmony, to agree, to keep the peace, to be friendlier, to just really a lot of behaviors that will cause their sort of unconscious stress level to go down because they're connecting, they're making sure that they're not being rejected, right? So some of those give in kind of behaviors. And so that's why you might see a situation where the boss is, pushing too hard and, hey guys, let's do this. And that in and of itself stresses out listeners. So they start to look more agreeable as opposed to saying what they really think. So you might say more of that. And what that leads to then is you might see listeners more likely when they're stressed out to be less confrontive, which means to hold on to things longer, to wait way too long before they speak up. So you kind of get that sort of a little bit of disappearing in some ways. Right. And then if someone's close to them, you might see just a lot more worrying coming from them.
Fretting.
And they might, talk about things that are stressing them out, but not really talking about them directly.
Right.
So, and now a red line, I call them a red line listener, someone that's in the red line stress zone, they might go into more of that conductor behavior, right? And that's when everybody in the room is like, what the
Where did that come from?
Right. Like, they take control.
Or they get mad.
You might see anger. And just these behaviors that you thought you wouldn't see from them.
Yeah.
Right. So it's, in that sense, it's those are fairly obvious to see from someone that might be like a deep into a listener type behavioral style.
Yeah, what happens is they blow up or something, it all kind of erupts, and it almost always feels to everyone else like that was just completely out of left field. Like you've been pleasant and agreeable and saying nothing and everything looks fine, and then suddenly you're angry. That's the experience you might have with a listener who gets to that red letter or red zone stress place.
For sure.
Hey,
all right.
I have to go to the bathroom really bad.
All right, go for it. All right. So next we're going to wade into some water.
This is some dangerous water.
Yeah. We're going to be talking about behavioral styles as they relate to cultures as well as sex and gender. So with that, let's talk a bit about cultures.
Well, this is tricky, and it's a little bit hard to do it without a visual, but I just want to say that behavior styles is a construct. It's based on observation. It's based on decades and decades and decades. I mean, this is as old as the hills, right? I mean, these behavioral differences have shown up for centuries. So scientific in that sense, but it's also a construct, and so this is tricky to talk about. So how do behavior styles vary in terms of culture? Because this is a construct, here's the way we look at it. The distribution of behavior styles, which, by the way, is roughly 25% analyzers, 25% promoters, 20% conductors, and 30% listeners, right? That general distribution holds true across cultures. However, the baseline in that culture is different between cultures. So that's going to make these behavior styles show up differently. It's almost like you move the center point. So a kind of an obvious, I don't know, obvious, but an example of right here in our own country, right? We've got a sort of classic West Coast, East Coast. And being in the business world like we are and all the consulting we do, we see the difference on the different coasts, Seattle versus New York. New Yorkers see the difference, Seattleites see the difference, right? There are differences in culture. So what you can do is you can say, let's take the behavior style grid and let's move the center point a little bit. This place is hard to explain, isn't it? So, Ethan, which behavior style, if you were just kind of stepping way back and you were based on what you know now, you go to New York, what behavior style might seem to be more prominent?
Oh, the stereotypical conductor, right? A little more direct, a little more taking control, a little more, this is the way we're doing it.
Speaking your mind.
Speaking your mind, right?
Yep, exactly. Now you go to Seattle. What
you may have people that are more the stereotypical listener. Maybe they tend to not talk about things as directly, to be more agreeable. And when you get those two people in the same room, you have quite the interaction.
Yeah, and I know this is stereotypical because certainly not everyone in Seattle or New York behaves those ways, but that really is a thing. Like when you talk to people that have been, worked in both places. I mean, I'll talk to people all the time who come from New York. Right. They've worked in New York. Now they're working in Seattle, and they're like, "Oh, this is crazy here." It's like passive aggressive around here. Right. Everybody gets offended when I tell them what I think, right? And then you got the Seattle person who goes to New York and like, "Man, everybody's so rude over here." Well, the behavior style distribution isn't different. Right. It's the center point that's different. It's kind of the expectation, and so conductors. So what that means is that...
Well, let me just add, I mean, that has... So what we're talking about, that has to do with culture, right? There's the West Coast culture and there's the East Coast culture. It has nothing to do with inherent personal traits at all. No. It has to do with...
What's accepted.
And...
What's normal.
In a lot of cases, what's rewarded.
Exactly. And so, it's not like New York attracted a whole bunch of conductors and Seattle attracted a whole bunch of listeners. That's not what happened. It just means the definition of conductor and listener has changed. So one way to look at it is you have somebody in Seattle who is a conductor, but they're a Seattle conductor, right? So they're going to be more blunt or more direct than the average Seattleite because they're a conductor. But they go to New York, they might actually show up as a listener because the grid has sort of shifted over there. Now we can take that to broader cultures. Let's talk about actual... all right. So I personally, my heritage is Greek, Italian. What might Thanksgiving dinner look like in a Greek Italian household.
Mm-hmm.
Come on, Ethan, be stereotypical.
Very promoter-like.
Yeah,
right. There's lots of loud, lots of
interrupting,
and emotionality in a sense, and demonstrative people.
Yes, and so that doesn't mean that everyone in Greece or Italy are promoters. It means the grid has shifted over there, right? So in that family, you might have somebody who is in the world of Greek Italians, they might be an analyzer.
Mm-hmm.
And in that, at that Thanksgiving dinner, it might look that way to everyone else in the room.
Right.
But if you take that very same person and move them into a Scandinavian dinner time, that analyzer is probably going to look a little bit more like a promoter.
Right.
Compared to the culture they're now in. I've spent a bunch of time in Africa because of this project that we do down there. Oh my gosh, it feels like I'm surrounded by conductors. Everyone's just telling everyone what to do, and no one's offended by it.
Right.
And they're not all conductors.
But if we were to run this behavioral style class, with the group that you work with,
They would be
distributed all over, right? You'd have the same distribution of analyzers and promoters, conductors, listeners, more or less.
Yeah, and this gets dangerous to talk about this because it could look like we're being racist, or we're really not. This is really about just the clear differences in the way people behave, the way they show up. So in some Asian countries, you might see what seems like a lot of analyzers, right? Less demonstrative, more methodical, etc. That's how it might look to me, but that's not how it looks there in that very culture. So does that make sense?
It does make sense. So let's take that example. So it seems to me that what may be true is that, say, if you're in a workplace in the U.S., right? And there's a handful of, as many workplaces are in the U.S., you got a handful of folks coming from different Western cultures, as well as a handful of folks coming from different Eastern cultures. Maybe you're in a workplace, so you have a lot of people coming from Eastern culture. Mm-hmm. And so you may see an imbalanced amount of those people coming from an Eastern culture falling within, say, the analyzer category, right? But you put those people, again, maybe in an Eastern culture, and they would not be there.
It'd be more nuancey.
It would be more nuancey. So it's something to keep in mind when we're working in workplaces and multicultural workplaces, that how they might be perceived if they come from a different culture might be different than how you're perceiving them here, in a sense.
Yeah, and let's put an asterisk on this because we are actually going to revisit. In general, we're going to talk about diversity. We're going to have a guest speaker. We're going to talk a lot, not a lot, but we are going to address differences in cultures, differences in ways people show up, ways people are perceived, even ways people are treated. We're going to talk about unconscious bias. So let's kind of tuck that away for now. Let's talk about sex and gender. And this one's tricky to talk about, partly because I don't even sometimes know what the right word is, and I'm just going to be honest about that. I think we're talking about sex.
I appreciate that.
We're talking about perceived gender and
let's,
sex.
For the sake of the conversation, and I know there's tons of nuances here, folks, but we're talking about sex, and we're using the word sex and gender maybe interchangeably in this conversation.
Yeah, when I say gender, I'm talking about perceived gender at this point, and we're talking about sex. Perceived sex. So for example, here's the way it works. The distribution of behavior styles is the same, whether you're a man or a woman. Men and women have the same distribution of behavior styles. However, what our society rewards and punishes is different, and I consider this important information and actually kind of sad.
Right. So, and before jumping into that, I would say, so again, there's no difference between behavioral styles among sexes.
Right.
The difference is how they might show up, though, among sexes.
The difference is how they're rewarded and punished more than how they show up. So, for example...
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so they did this, they did this study. So they wrote a story about each of the 4 behavior styles. They wrote these 4 stories, and we'll kind of pick on conductors here. So there's a conductor, and the story includes this person, being involved with a lot of really great sports in high school and being on the debate team and excelling in a lot of ways. You can tell from the story this person's pretty direct. They love a challenge. They moved up in their company post college and became a CEO. They make bold decisions. They say what they think. So, etc. There's a story about a conductor. These subjects, these test subjects read this story, but half of them read the story and it was describing David. And so the only different, and the other half was reading about Debbie, let's say. The only difference literally was the names David and Debbie and the pronouns. That's it. Other than that, they were identical. Later on, the test subjects are asked to describe these different people that they read about, this person they read about. The people who read about David used mostly positive words. He was brave, he was courageous, he was direct, he was assertive when necessary, he liked a challenge, etc. The people who read about, who did I say? Deborah? I forgot what her name was. Debbie. Aggressive, pushy. She got negative words.
Right.
And it was exact same story.
Right.
And what that's telling us is that our society gives you permission to have a certain behavior style based on your sex. But if you have another behavior style coupled with that sex, you get in trouble.
Right, exactly. And so, and they've had other studies as well as even from birth, they actually in one classic study they had adults show infants a video of a jack-in-the-box popping out, and male babies were more likely to be their reaction to be perceived as anger. Right, that was anger is what they're seeing from that male baby.
Oh wow!
Now for the female babies, it was a much wider range of emotion, and they've also found that mothers of young children have repeatedly been found to talk more to their girls and employ a wider range of kind of deeper emotional vocabulary with them than they do with men or their babies. Male babies. With them, they tend to linger a little bit more on anger. So when you say it's the difference in the way that what's rewarded in society, that is true.
From day one.
Right. And females often get punished a little bit more for showing up with anger, and males, it's a lot more accepted.
Oh, that's exactly right. So what I want to just make sure that I'm hearing what you're saying. So you're not saying that the male babies with the jack-in-the-box were showing more anger. You're saying what they were showing was perceived as anger.
Right.
And what the girls were perceived as feeling was maybe surprise or fear or some
it's
other.
Just a much broader range of emotions.
Yeah. And okay, so let's follow that up. Another study, they showed adults, or they would hand adults a baby with a pink hat or a blue hat. Right. And the perception, of course, was that was a girl, that was a boy. The way the adults talked or what they said to those babies, I guess it kind of goes with what you're saying. The girls were perceived as sweet and pretty, and the boys were perceived as strong. How strong can you be? You're 3 hours old, right? But you're strong, right? Because you're a boy. So what we have is we have society now telling you who you are supposed to be and who you are not supposed to be from day one.
Right.
And I find that sad. And if you take that conductor story I mentioned with the story, the opposite happened with the listeners.
Mm-hmm.
The male listeners were given more negative adjectives.
Right.
And the female listeners were perceived more positive.
Right. So in earlier, I did make the comment of might be a difference in the way it shows up, which I think is a result of the way society punishes or rewards different behaviors, whether male or female, right? So there will be differences maybe in the way these behavioral styles show up, but it's not necessarily innate. Innate.
Yeah. In fact, I cannot tell you how many times I've worked with a female manager, executive even. They've got more to deal with, and they have spent way more energy adjusting and trying on new behaviors and trying to figure out how to not come across too assertive and not come across too weak. And
right.
it's a bit of a mind field. That's the F word I was looking for there.
Yeah, a mind field.
That's it.
So yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of that when we're talking about sex, and there are some small nuances I think in the way people show up and what I think, like, among conductors, I think, competitiveness might be more outwardly with men as far as they tend to be more competitive with others compared to females that are just as competitive, but it tends to be more competitive maybe with themselves.
Yeah. And again, is that innate or is that kind of what our society sort of pushed them into? I don't know.
Yeah. And I think probably debacle on that forever.
Debacle on that?
Yeah.
How about debate on that?
I think debacle is a more fun word. Put it there.
Let's talk. What's our time? I always ask you this, dude. Where are we at?
Well, we are under an hour still, but we should probably wrap this up pretty soon. So, so far we've talked about everything from trust to stress to cultures to sex. And I think those are all just important things to keep in mind as we are interacting with people in the workplace. And ultimately, if you take one thing away from all this, it's understanding that people are complicated, right? Society's complicated. And we need to have that in mind before we, pass judgment in a lot of ways. So that being said, how do you want to close this episode up? Because I think there was one more subject you wanted to touch on.
Before we kind of wrap up, I just want to say, a word of caution. I just think that it's so important to know this. It helps you be a better manager. It helps you with your personal growth. But we also got to be careful that we don't use behavior styles against each other, right? We don't use that against our employees. And what I mean by that is I've seen people who've gone through our class, and if I don't give them this warning, it can go sideways a little bit, right? You can get this sort of, you're an analyzer. You need more time. So I'm going to give you more time now because you're an analyzer.
Right.
Oh, you're a promoter. Oh, yeah, you're gonna have to tell us how you feel.
That's not about putting people in boxes like that.
No, and it's also, when I hear that language, it's embarrassing for the other person. It kind of feels like you're using the behavior style as a way of being sarcastic or a way of sort of clubbing the other person, as opposed to the way it's supposed to be used is you to understand that other person and give more grace and more understanding, and then to make some adjustments for yourself. So I just want to ask our listeners to be really careful that you don't grab these labels and start putting them on other people and saying things like, oh, you're a listener, so therefore you're not going to speak your mind.
Right.
That is not helpful, and in fact is going to probably hurt trust and respect, as opposed to enhance trust and respect, which is what this whole thing is about.
I totally agree. And I think too often people just get the very surface level understanding of behavior styles, and they do exactly what you were just talking about. They use it more as this is how I'm going to start treating you because you are always like this because you're always an analyzer. Right? And that's not the point. The point is to have these general concepts in mind so we have better conversations, better interactions, better relationships, and more trust.
That's exactly right. So, hey, before we wrap up, I just want to say, we've got a half day and a full day and even a follow-up day behavior style workshop. We've got lots of other workshops. We have our 5-day Managing with Mind and Heart management course, which does include this, but we also do this as a standalone. So, hey.
It's our most popular menu item, if you will. People like it, and they've liked it so much that we've been pushed to design a phase 2 behavioral styles class, which we have. So would love to hear from you all if you're interested in learning more about this class, as well as our broader leadership training. You can shoot us a message over at contact@nashconsulting.com. You can check out our website, nashconsulting.com. Besides that, folks, I hope you enjoyed this series on behavior styles. I know it was a long one, and if you're listening to this episode and you've listened to all the other ones, good for you.
Congratulations. You made it.
Thanks for coming this far with us. We are excited for all the upcoming episodes. We have a lot more to talk about. Until then, ciao.